Okay, so we're ready, as I said, to kick off session one. I'm very happy to invite Mishel Ghassibe to present the first paper, which is on business cycles and pricing cascades. That's joint work with Anton Nakov here from the ECB. Mishel, you will have 25 minutes for your presentation. I'll give you a warning on the time. And then afterwards, I'm happy to invite then James Costain will be discussing the paper. So, Mishel, I pass the floor to you, 25 minutes.
Can you hear me? Good. Yeah, thanks so much for this very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here as always in Frankfurt. This is joint work with Anton Nakov from the home team, and the usual disclaimer applies for that reason. So what we're doing in this paper, we're trying to revisit the resurgence of interest in inflation that we observed in the last couple of years. And I think there are three particular aspects that have interested us. The first one is this whole idea that even in advanced economies where you have the entire infrastructure like inflation targeting to prevent inflation resurges, you can still get these gigantic increases in the rates of inflation. So in the euro area, in the US, in the UK, and so on, we've seen this persistent double-digit rates of inflation despite all the infrastructure that has been set up in place. The second key feature is that at the micro level, when you look at the origins of this inflation, a lot of it in advanced economies came from the surge in the frequency of adjustments. So it's not only coming from firms that are adjusting by more conditional on adjusting, it's also coming from a larger fraction of firms adjusting. And the third aspect is that the origins of this aggregate surge in inflation have mainly been sector specific. So shocks to industries such as oil, agriculture, and so on have contributed greatly to the overall increase in inflation. So all these three features, of course, very important, but the unfortunate feature is that the sort of models that we have at our disposal that are popular both in academia and in central banks tend to be linearized models, so they cannot talk about large swings. They tend to be models with a fixed fraction of adjusters, such as Calvo model, and they also tend to be a one-sector model. You cannot talk about sector-specific drivers of inflation. So what we're trying to do here is to develop a new business cycle framework that can help us think about episodes of the sort that we've seen recently. So we really want to add the minimal set of ingredients to help us understand these features. Now, what are these minimal sets of ingredients? Well, we need a model with three things. First, we're going to have a model with many sectors interconnected by networks to make sure you can have sector-specific shocks that are propagating and causing aggregate fluctuations. The second minimal ingredient we need is state-dependent pricing. So we need the frequency of adjustment and more broadly all pricing moments to be endogenous and vary over the business cycle. And third, we need to solve them all fully nonlinearly. So abstract from linearizations to think about large swings. So that's the new framework we're going to develop. And then we're also setting up kind of benchmarks against which we're trying to evaluate the performance of this model. And there are three broad benchmarks or issues that we'd like this model to address. The first one, you cannot see here, the first real challenge is that a good model to think about inflation and quantities of the business cycle should be a model with a realistic non-neutrality of money or realistic slope of the New Keynesian Phillips curve. That's something we'll try to get in this model. And a big issue with this slope idea is that as soon as you match the slope, you usually need very big shocks to rationalize the inflation given that slope. So Jean-Paul Lullier here in the audience has a great paper about this point, that they always face this tension between slope of the Phillips curve and the sizes of shocks you need to generate a double-digit inflation surge. And that's something we'll try to address with our paper. The second benchmark is the ability to kind of match the micro origins of inflation. We want our model to generate a realistic surge in the frequency of adjustment without, of course, the usual problem associated with that, which is the implausibly steep Phillips curve that you usually get in models, say fixed menu cost model, that you need to match the surge in frequency. And the third benchmark against which we'll evaluate our model is the ability to achieve 1 and 2 with shocks that are structurally interpretable. So we want shocks, say to oil or to agriculture, that can be directly disciplined with the data. We want them to be able to generate this realistic surge in inflation given the slope, as we see in the data. So that's kind of the broad things we want to achieve in this paper. So the reason why the paper will, I think, pass all of those kind of tests pretty well, otherwise I wouldn't be presenting it here probably. But the reason why it's doing all right, I think, is because of a novel theoretical channel that happens to be so important that it made it to the title of the paper. And this mechanism is called pricing cascades. So what we define by pricing cascades in this paper is a situation whenever large movements in aggregates trigger additional price adjustments at the extensive margin. So that's just definition of cascades in this paper. And the nice thing about cascades is that it actually helps you both on the side of matching the slope of the Phillips curve and on the side of generating inflation with structural and interpretable shocks. And how you do that? Well, key thing is that it interacts differently with different kinds of shocks. So as we show for demand shocks, such as monetary interventions, networks actually slow down movements at the extensive margin of adjustment. So they create what we call cascades dampening. The reason why that's happening is because in models with intermediate inputs with networks, nominal wages, or more generally, nominal prices of primary factors account for a small fraction of your marginal cost, the rest being accounted for by intermediate inputs. Demand interventions affect primary nominal prices of primary input prices. So whenever there's a surge, say in money supply or easing of nominal interest rates, you do generate this change in nominal wage, say, but it accounts for a tiny fraction of your marginal cost movements, which means your kind of desired price changes are small. So you're much less likely to be willing to pay the cost of adjustment, right? For that reason, even very big demand surges, say coming from central bank interventions, are generating very little inflation in the aggregate because they affect marginal cost so little. And that's the reason the model will be generating a very flat Phillips curve, even in the limit of a fixed menu cost economy, which is usually be an issue for menu cost models. Now, at the same time, networks speed up or amplify the extensive margin after supply shocks. And that's called cascades amplification. To see why that's happening, again, let's consider a simple example. Imagine there's an aggregate TFP deterioration. This naturally mechanically increases your marginal cost 1-for-1, and that would be the only effect you would get in a standard model with only labor in production. Now, with networks, there's another effect working on top of that, which is the prices of your suppliers that are going up in equilibrium. So you get like a double whammy increasing your marginal cost, coming both from direct TFP deterioration and from the surge in your input prices. And this double whammy increase in your costs, of course, makes your desired price change very large, making you more willing to pay the cost of adjustment on the margin. And that's why you're really amplifying the extensive margin of adjustment, which in the aggregate helps to generate a gigantic inflationary surge of this kind we saw a few years ago. And crucially, you can do that without shocks that are too large. So moderately sized shocks, either aggregate supply shocks or shocks to sectors that are major and concentrated suppliers to the rest of the economy. I'll be very precise about the meaning of major and concentrated with the novel network statistics. That can help explain the aggregate surge in inflation as well as the surge in the frequency of adjustment. So that's really what's going on. The novel channel, which is generated by the interaction of the three additional ingredients, help us generate both a flat Phillips curve and a realistic surge in inflation with structural interpretable shocks. That's what the paper is about. Let me jump straight into the model. So it's a setup where you have households that are very standard. So you have a representative household with log linear utility and a cash and advance constraint. So the central bank will be controlling money supply, which we introduced through this constraint. Of course, we can extend this as we do in the paper to cashless limit with the Taylor rule and so on. But for today, it will be a cash economy. So consumers have like n sectors in their baskets, and there's a Cobb-Douglas aggregator over them. And then on top of that, within each sector, there's a variety of firms producing these differentiated goods. Key thing you should notice here, we introduce this idiosyncratic quality shock, zeta, which is kind of the thing that will be generating heterogeneity across varieties within the sector. Here, and this quality process follows a random walk in logs. Now, firms are more interesting. So each firm has access to a Cobb-Douglas production technology of the following kind. So the output of a firm J in sector I at time T has a few components. The first component is, again, the inverse of this idiosyncratic quality part. The second component is sector-specific productivity A. And then you have the labor input of that firm L and the intermediate inputs bought from the other sectors. Here, omega IK is the cost share that firms in sector I buy from sector K. That's the meaning of that parameter. Now, if you've solved the cost minimization problem associated with this production function, you get a marginal cost expression, which for me really summarizes the mechanism of this paper. So the marginal cost naturally rises in the quality of the variety, falls in productivity, and beyond that is some combination between the nominal wage and the prices of intermediates weighted by your exposure to them in the cost share sense. So again, to me, the form of this marginal cost conveys the key cascades mechanism that we really get in this paper. So how? Imagine I killed production networks. I only had labor in production. Then alpha will be 1, and all these omegas would be 0. In equilibrium with log linear preferences, wages equal to money supply. So money supply and productivity are isomorphic in their effect on the marginal cost up to sign. So if you have a doubling of money supply, or if you have a kind of doubling of productivity, that would have the same effect on the marginal cost up to sign. All right. Now, once you add these intermediate inputs, crucially, they are no longer the same, and they actually move in opposite directions in terms of the kind of amplification or dampening of the effect on the marginal cost. So now, if you have a doubling of money supply, it creates an increase in the marginal cost only to the extent to which wages affect the marginal cost, right? And since prices are sticky in equilibrium, they will not adjust by as much as the wage. So a doubling of money supply now creates a less than doubling of marginal cost. And that's what kind of dampens your desired price changes. At the same time, now if you have this deterioration in productivity, this still has a one-for-one effect on your marginal cost. And on top of that, the prices will go up in equilibrium, creating a double whammy of an increase in marginal cost, which amplifies the desired price changes and makes you, as we'll see later, more willing to pay the cost of adjustment in the margin. That's what's going on here. It's kind of marginal cost expression, which is driving the differential cascades channel. All right. Now, pricing is interesting, more interesting than before. So as I promised, we have state-dependent pricing. So resetting the nominal price involves paying the sector-specific menu cost kappa measured in labor hours. Okay, tiny technical points. Since both money supply and this quality are non-stationary, you need to keep track of stationary objects. The correct stationary object here at the firm level is this nominal price adjusted by quality and money supply, which we call the quality adjusted log real price. That's the stationary kind of micro level object, which allows you to Bellmanize the whole pricing problem. So you can say that the value of a firm in sector I at time t, which has just set this quality adjusted real price P, contains the contemporaneous profits D and the continuation value. The continuation value is saying that with some endogenous probability, you will not adjust next period. And if you do not adjust, you get the value associated with the eroded real price. If you do not adjust the nominal price, your real price will still change. It will change because it will be eroded by the quality realization and by money growth. With some complementary and endogenous probability, you will adjust your price, in which case you get the maximized value net of the menu cost. That's the Bellman equation associated with pricing. And of course, depending on the functional form of eta, this probability of adjustment function, you can nest a variety of pricing models. So if eta was a fixed number, eta bar, and kappa was 0, you'll be back in the Calvo model with the fixed probability of adjustment. In the paper, we can nest basically anything here. For perhaps pedagogical reasons, we'll consider the diagonal opposite of Calvo, which is the Ghassibe-Lucas menu cost model, which just says that the probability of adjustment is a step function, where you adjust with probability 1 if your value gained from adjustment exceeds the menu cost, and you adjust with probability 0 otherwise. But we can nest anything in between Ghassibe-Lucas and Calvo by appropriately parameterizing eta, and we can actually use that to match any kind of steady-state distribution of price changes that you like, that you observe in the micro data sets, such as Prisma here in the Euro area. So to understand what is going on and exactly why you're getting these cascades, let's consider a simplified version of the problem kind of in a static way. So let me kill foresight. Let me say that everyone is just myopic and discounts the future fully, in which case you can only focus on the initial time period. We know that in this world, the whole value is just contemporaneous profits. And we know that the kind of value of profit gained from adjusting your price is approximately quadratic in your price gap. Your price gap is kind of a deviation between where your price is now and where you'd like your price to be in the profit maximizing sense. That's the price gap. And then since the production function is Cobb-Douglas, we can actually analytically solve for the optimal reset price for any firm in sector I, right? So with the Cobb-Douglas production, the optimal real reset price for any firm in sector I is just 1 over the productivity of that sector times kind of this weighted average of your supplier's real prices, again, weighted by your input-output cost shares. And then we can plug this P star into the expression for the price gap, right? So in logs, the price gap now has 2 terms, kind of the more standard term, which we know from the menu cost literature, which is erosion. If you do not adjust your nominal price, your real price and your price gap get eroded by quality draw and by money supply growth. That's the standard part. The new part is that when you have intermediate inputs, it's also getting eroded by the productivity realization in that sector, as well as the movements in your supplier's prices. Why? Because both the sectoral productivity and your supplier's prices affect your optimal reset price, right? So if you do not adjust your price, but the reset price is moving, your price gap is also moving around, okay? That's the new part. Yeah. Now, as you notice, if I plug in this P tilde back into the value gain of adjustment expression, the only idiosyncratic component here is the idiosyncratic quality draw, which means I can explicitly solve for the inaction regions for each firm, which tell me whether or not I should adjust given some realizations of aggregate sectoral variables. We can do that, okay? So for monetary shocks, here's the expression for the inaction region. So if I kill, there's no supply shocks, only for monetary shocks. The inaction region is centered around kind of this money supply net of your supplier's real prices, and the width is governed by kind of the size of the menu cost. So imagine there were no networks and I increased my money supply. That would be the goal of Lucas economy. What happens is that your inaction region shifts to the left, and you can see that you need really extreme draws of quality, really extreme negative draws of quality to still not adjust, which means the probability of adjustment is going up by a lot, right? You see that the probability that you draw the idiosyncratic quality here in this new inaction region is tiny, right? That's what will be happening in the standard menu cost economy. Now, as soon as you add networks, the real prices of your suppliers are also moving, right? And to the extent to which prices of your suppliers are sticky, they will increase less than 1-for-1 with money supply, which means your real sectoral prices will fall after the money supply increase. And the fall in the real prices of your suppliers creates a counteracting movements in your inaction region. In other words, the sort of values of the idiosyncratic quality that you need to not adjust are not as extreme as before, right? So the probability of adjustment is rising, but it's not rising by as much as it would without networks. And that's the key reason why you get cascades dampening. And you can actually formally prove that this change in the adjustment probability that is coming from networks following a money shock M is approximately proportional to the customer centrality of each sector. In other words, the more you are exposed to intermediate inputs in the total sense, directly or indirectly, as captured by the customer centrality metric, by more will your probability of adjustment get shrunk by networks. That's the cascades dampening channel formula. Now, with productivity shocks, you get the opposite, right? So if there were no networks, productivity shocks are isomorphic to money supply shocks up to sign. So if there's a fall in productivity, the inaction region shifts to the left, right? That's the standard channel. But then on top of that, the real prices of your suppliers are going up, which means you get a further shift to the left of your inaction region. So you really need extreme draws of quality to still not adjust. Or in other words, the probability of adjustment is going up by really a lot following this supply shock. And again, you can formalize that by saying that the amplification in your adjustment probability following an aggregate TFP shock A is approximately proportional to your customer centrality. So the more exposed you are to intermediate inputs, the stronger is the amplification coming from networks. And that was for aggregate productivity shock. We can actually do this for sector-specific productivity shocks and study their effect on aggregate probability of adjustment. And you can formally prove that after a productivity shock to sector A, the response of aggregate probability of adjustment, economy-wide probability of adjustment, rho bar, is approximately proportional to a novel centrality metric called the supply Herfindahl of the shocked sector. The supply Herfindahl of the shocked sector consists of your average supplier centrality, or Katz-Bonacci centrality squared, plus a novel term, which captures the dispersion in other sectors' exposure to you as a supplier. So if you're really a disproportional exposure, kind of disproportionate supplier to some parts of this economy, so the variance term is high, conditional on some average importance, your ability to affect aggregate probability of adjustment will be stronger. If you really want to see which sectors are able to drive the aggregate adjustment probability well, the theory predicts that those are the sectors with the high supply Herfindahl, either major sectors or sectors that are disproportionately important to some parts of the economy. Let me just kind of summarize the theory part with a few simple examples. So if you had a simple roundabout economy with one sector, firms trading within that sector, you can see that if I kill networks and only had labor and production, monetary and productivity shocks are isomorphic up to sign, which means frequency of adjustment will kind of increase by the same amount as you start at different shock sizes. Now, as soon as you add networks, you can see that probability is rising by a lot less after money shocks. And that's the cascades dampening effect in action. On the other hand, it's rising super quickly after aggregate supply shocks, and that's the cascades amplification channel in action. Another simple example is a two-sector economy with an upstream sector and a downstream sector. So the upstream sector uses labor, produces intermediates, sells that to the downstream sector who sells output to households. Those sectors are equally big in equilibrium. They have the same pricing statistics. The only ex ante difference is their position in the supply chain. And you can see that whenever you shock the upstream sector, the aggregate frequency of adjustment is rising a lot faster than when you shock the downstream sector. And that's because shocking the upstream sector affects the marginal cost and the reset price, both in that upstream sector and in the downstream sector. But this does not work in the other direction. If you shock the downstream sector, you only affect that sector's marginal cost and reset price. And that's once again the Cascades amplification channel in action. Finally, if you have this vertical supply chain, whenever you shock the more upstream sector, you affect marginal costs and reset prices everywhere else downstream, which means you can affect aggregate frequency adjustment by a lot, but not vice versa, which once again is the Cascades amplification channel in action. In the final 5 minutes I've got, let me show you some quantitative results. So we calibrate this model to the euro area economy, where the aggregate parameters are very standard. The sectoral parameters are the input-output coefficients coming from world input-output tables. And we also estimate the sector-specific menu cost and standard deviations of idiosyncratic shocks to match sector-specific frequency and size of standard deviation of price changes from the Prisma dataset for the euro area. So for monetary shocks, the key picture is on the left-hand side. Here we study how the aggregate frequency of adjustment responds to money shocks of different sizes in economies with and without networks. And you can see that in the economy with networks, the frequency rises by a lot less, even after a very big money shock. And that just shows you that in a rich quantitative model, this cascades dampening effect is very strong, which is also translated into much stronger non-neutrality of money, even in the limit of a fixed menu cost economy with networks. So you can see that relative to the blue line, which is the GDP in the economy with menu cost and without networks, GDP responds a lot more strongly to money shocks. And perhaps another way to visualize that is to kind of scatter the fully nonlinear Phillips curve by kind of hitting the economy with money shocks of different sizes and looking at the implied combination of inflation and the cumulative output gap. You can see that in the Golos of Lucas economy without networks is basically vertical. In the Calvo economy is horizontal. And the Golos of Lucas economy with networks is actually closer to the Calvo economy than to the Golos of Lucas economy without networks. So that's really why you get this flattening of the Phillips curve as coming from cascades dampening. Aggregate TFP shocks, you get the opposite. So after supply shocks, aggregate supply shocks that are big, the economy with networks features a very strong surge in adjustment frequency, much stronger than without networks, right? Which translates into CPI inflation, which has a very nonlinear dynamic. So you see that even after relatively small aggregate TFP shocks, the economy with networks and menu costs delivers a strong surge in frequency, whereas the Calvo economy would require gigantic shocks, like minus 10%, to generate a 1% month-on-month inflation surge, roughly something we saw in the euro area post-COVID, right? That's the reason Calvo struggles so much to generate inflation with realistically sized shocks. Sector-specific shocks, we also shock kind of the economy with supply shocks to different sectors of minus 20%. Key thing for some sectors, such as food and beverages, chemicals, and so on, the economy with networks features a much stronger aggregate frequency surge, which really means networks are somehow amplifying shocks to these specific sectors, and it does not really amplify the other sectors' shocks so much. And what's really special about those sectors? Well, the theory section in the simple setup told us there was a supply Herfindahl being major and concentrated. And that continues to be the case in the rich model. When you plot the aggregate frequency surge against the supply Herfindahl, you can see a very strong linear relationship. So it's really about being major and concentrated, which is driving your ability to affect aggregate adjustment frequency. If you try to plot this with just Katz-Banach's centrality, so the standard supplier centrality measure, this would not work. So it's not enough to just consider average centrality. What matters is being central and concentrated. Final thing, in the last 1 minute, let me apply this model to think about euro area inflation. So what I'll do, I will feed in only 4 shocks into the model and see the extent to which the model can explain aggregate frequency and inflation dynamics. I will feed in an aggregate demand shock coming from euro area nominal GDP. I will feed in energy and food price shocks as sector-specific supply shocks to match the energy price movements and food price movements. And finally, I will feed in a productivity process of the labor union sector to exactly match the earnings dynamics in the euro area. Once you feed in those 4 shocks, you can see 2 things. So just these 4 shocks can explain essentially the entire surge in inflation in the euro area up to 11%. So we're matching the peaks very well. And you can also match the surge in frequency extremely well. It was just 4 shocks without appealing to markup shocks, cost push shocks, or any other constructs of that kind which have no structural interpretation. Once you remove these supply shocks, the commodity price shocks, you can see that the model generates essentially no CPI inflation surge and no frequency surge, which means in the euro area, aggregate demand shocks and labor market shocks are really not enough to explain the inflation surge. You really need the commodity price movements to explain the inflation surge in the euro area. What if we remove various model sub-ingredients? If you remove the network structure but keep the menu costs, you can see that it can explain maybe 5% of inflation surge out of 11. So really, networks seem to be important. And you explain essentially none of the frequency surge. So just having menu costs but not having networks is really not enough to explain the inflation surge and the frequency surge. At the same time, imagine I kept the networks but replaced menu costs with Calvo. Well, then you can explain about 7% inflation out of 11. But of course, by construction, you explain none of the frequency surge because the frequency is fixed by construction. So just having networks gets you 7%, but the additional 400 basis points is really coming from the frequency surge, which you're missing with the Calvo model. All in all, you really need the combination of networks, menu costs, and large shocks to the supply to the commodity sectors to explain the euro area experience post-COVID. And I think with that, I will conclude. So I've shown you a new model which combines network, state-dependent pricing, and nonlinear solutions. It creates pricing cascades, which are extremely important for understanding the euro area inflation experience post-COVID. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mishel, for this great first presentation. Let me now invite James Costain to the podium, please. James is a research economist at Banco de España, and he will discuss the paper. So, James, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be discussing this this beautiful paper. Let's see. How do I advance these? There we go. Okay, so the way that I see this paper is that it's talking about a very old idea in macro theory, the idea that strategic complementarities are the key ingredient to make tiny frictions in price adjustment really matter at the macro level. And so we've known that in theory ever since for example, the paper of Cooper and John, 1988, but that's always been a very difficult thing to actually make work quantitatively. So what I feel is that 30 years later, here is a paper that really quantitatively shows how the fact that my suppliers may not adjust at the same time that I do slows down aggregate adjustment in the economy and thereby increases non-neutrality. And on the other hand, Mishel was also showing that this allows the response to supply shocks to speed up, create this cascade, and have a large effect on inflation. Okay, so these are actually old ideas, but it's a tremendously challenging thing to finally model in a quantitative way, because what it's doing is it's putting together two extremely technically challenging literatures. That is to say, the state-dependent pricing literature required the whole development of heterogeneous agent macroeconomics in order to implement that, and then at the same time, this is also all based on the literature on macroeconomic networks, another heavily technical area of macro literature. So we're putting together these two frameworks, which by themselves are each difficult to work with, and at the same time, the authors are not losing track of the data. This is not just a theoretical example. It seems to me that it is quite close to really being a quantitative description of what's gone on, particularly in over the course of the COVID pandemic. Okay, so main findings, input-output relationships really matter for aggregate dynamics, and they matter in a very different way for demand shocks and for supply shocks. Okay, so in particular, price adjustment in response to monetary shocks is slowed down by the networks. In response to productivity shocks, it's sped up by the network relationships. Okay, the authors show that these effects are really strongly nonlinear. There's a huge difference in the shape of the impulse response to a 1% shock versus, say, a 10% shock. The authors derive analytical formulas for which sectors in the economy matter. That's what they call network centrality. And then they do a simulation of post-COVID inflation. They show that they can get the size of the fluctuations roughly right, and that all of these model ingredients are really needed to do that. Okay, so just very, very briefly, how do they make this whole complicated model tractable? Well, first of all, it's because of this log linear utility framework. There's going to be a constant marginal disutility of labor, and so then that allows you to make the wage essentially exogenous. The wage ends up being a shock that equals the money supply in equilibrium, right? So that's just treating an important part of the economy as a shock, but what it allows you to do is then endogenize all of the price dynamics through the network. So their economy has an empirically relevant number of goods producing sectors, and within each sector, there's a continuum of firms. Each firm produces one variety, and each one is subject to menu costs. So then aggregate consumption is an aggregate across sectors. Likewise, the inputs to any firm are an aggregate across sectors, okay? It's the same aggregation. So basically, all of that stuff aggregates up in a tractable way. Likewise, aggregation over firms it's the same for consumption and for materials inputs, and so again, it's tractable. And then the other very nice thing that they do is that they have one sector they call the labor union. So the labor union is the only sector in their model that buys labor time. So workers all sell their labor time to the labor union. Then the labor union is a state-dependent pricer, just like the others. So it pays a menu cost to adjust the salary, and so that gives you sticky wages, okay? And so they can then look at how that's the ultimate upstream sector. They look at how that propagates through the economy as well. Okay, all right. So one of the really nice things about this paper is that they give these analytical formulas for how adjustment frequency varies in each sector. And so I'm just showing you the formula, not that I can explain it at high speed, but this expression is written in a way such that the log Markov, now the log markup mu bar on average is 0. So after a money shock, assuming that that your input suppliers do not all immediately adjust, your markup is going to fall, okay? And so mu bar is going to become negative, and that's why you get a negative term in here that is offsetting the money shock M, and so that will give you the dampening effect on money supply shocks. Okay, so the formula is very similar for the case of TFP shocks. It's just that then all of the network related terms enter with the opposite sign. But basically, instead of having the money shock M, you have the TFP shock A, and then the terms go on the opposite sign, go with the opposite sign. So you get exactly the same analytics for both types of shocks. Okay, so Mishel explained this very well. So I guess the only thing I would say here is that when we look, what exactly is being shown in this diagram, the initial movement without networks means setting the input shares from all sectors to 0. So that includes, for example, the share from the labor union. Okay, so the case without networks is setting all of the omegas to 0, and it's setting alpha, the labor share, equal to 1. So in the economy without networks is simultaneously eliminating all of the network heterogeneity, all of the inputs, and all of the labor supply from the labor union. So it's mixing a bunch of effects, okay, which is fine, but it would be nice to separate some of these things. Okay, all right. I have to get to my final comments because otherwise I'm not going to have time. So so input-output structure is very important here, but as I was just saying, the demonstration in the paper really hasn't separated out the effects, and it would be extremely interesting to know how much of this is driven by wage stickiness, how much of this is driven by the existence of inputs with sticky prices, and how much is driven by the heterogeneity of the structure of the network. Okay, and so there are some nice exercises that you could do. So, for example, imposing Basu-style roundabout production, that just means setting all of the omegas equal, except for the one on the labor union. Okay, that would be a very natural exercise to report. You could put it in the same graphs, and it would help a lot. Why is that useful? Well, I like the realism of this heterogeneous setup, but if other people are going to apply this, they're not going to want to do the whole heterogeneity thing. They're just going to want wages, inputs, and so forth. So that would be a much easier model to work with, and it would be very interesting to know, do you get most of your effects or not? Okay. So a second major suggestion is, it's nice that you show that you can make the Ghassibe-Lucas fixed menu cost framework work, but I feel that the goal of this paper is actually quantitative realism. So if you're going to do quantitative realism, why work with a setup which we know does not match microdata on prices? Okay, so I'd be much more interested to see some sort of setup with a smooth hazard function. Anton and I have written down some possible microfoundations for smooth adjustment hazards, but there are many possible microfoundations for that. We know those things fit the data better, so why not make that your base case? And in fact, Alvarez, Lippi, and Oskolkov have shown in principle how you can back out the right distribution of stochastic menu costs to match any observed price distribution. So I'd make that your base case. Put Ghassibe-Lucas in the appendix. And then the last thing is, this paper has a ton of useful exercises. It has both toy examples and serious quantitative examples, but what it really doesn't have is a lot of testing. So the one part of the paper that really tests the mechanism is the final exercise about matching COVID dynamics. I like that very much, but that only asks whether your mechanism works at the aggregate level. What I'd really like to see is, can you test your model against sectoral evidence? So like you showed that there's this relationship between Herfindahl's and adjustment probabilities, but if I'm not mistaken, that's the relationship in your model. If you can give evidence for that in the data, then this paper would have a much greater possibility of publishing as well as I believe it deserves to be published. So this is a fantastic paper. I believe it will be very influential, but it's still a work in progress, and I think there's stuff that could be done. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James, for that very lively discussion. Let me then just invite people in the room and also people online via Slido to, if anyone has any questions now, that we can take them. And then I'd ask maybe Mishel to respond to James and any other questions that might be in the room. Maybe I could ask it very quickly. I was interested, first of all, great paper, really liked it. What is your intuition on, say, global value chains? So I would imagine that this should, if you've got, say, a more domestic supplier base, then the demand cascades would be, let's say, less dampened, I would say. But what does that mean maybe on the supply side? What's your intuition? If we're moving to a world where you've less global supply chains, how would that influence the model predictions, do you think?
And thanks a lot for this question. Let me probably address yours and then get back to Jim's points. So I think the intuition for the global value chains would be that if you're becoming less exposed to labor abroad, essentially, then wages in China or wages somewhere abroad are less relevant for your marginal cost. And what becomes more relevant is the wages domestically, which are controlled effectively by the central bank. So in that sense, if you're moving to a less globalized economy, this cascades dampening effect should be stronger. So you'd be getting a flatter Phillips curve coming from you leaving global value chains. I think that would be the prediction that, yeah, cascades dampening will be stronger if your supply chain is becoming less global, because domestic wages will become more important for your marginal cost. And then coming to Jim's points, let me probably address the first one. So on the roundabout economy, I agree that would be fantastic to have some benchmarks with Basu-style economies. We know that formally the adjustment frequency are approximately quadratic in those centralities. So we know that if you collapse an economy down to a one-sector economy with some average centrality, by Jensen's inequality, it will not be the same in terms of frequency movement. So we can show formally that heterogeneity matters for aggregate outcomes. But I agree that we could perhaps play with some diagonal input-output structures which are more tractable. Yeah, we can also remove wage stickiness to see how important that channel is for the Phillips curve shape. Smooth hazard pricing, well, with Anton on the paper, is a bit of a crime to not have that. And if there's one person who knows how to implement that exactly, it's Anton. So we should definitely do smooth hazard pricing, especially if we could try and use that to match sector-specific distributions of non-zero price changes, not just specific moments, by entire distribution shapes. I don't know if the Prisma dataset could give us sector-specific histograms for distributions of price changes, but if we did have that, we'd be able to fit smooth hazard functions sector by sector to address that point. On the empirical evidence front, I think, again, if from the Prisma dataset, we can get a time series for the sector-specific frequency of adjustment, we could regress the sector-specific adjustment frequencies on measures of centrality and see if it is indeed true that if you're a sector with a higher customer centrality, condition on a monetary shock, your frequency is moving by less, and vice versa for aggregate supply shock. So I think here the constraint is really the availability of sectoral frequency data, which we'd love to get from the institutions collecting that. But overall, thanks so much for the fantastic discussion and for the question.
Thanks, Mishel. We actually have another question from Jean-Paul in the room, and
Peter.
Then Peter afterwards.
So in terms of Golos of Lucas versus Calvo Plus, I actually think Golos of Lucas is the right starting point for the paper, because, you know, what you want to know is, you know, you start from this very difficult benchmark in terms of fitting the aggregate data, and how much networks and, you know, all the amazing stuff that Mishel and his co-author do is how much does it bring to the table, how much you can improve upon that. You know, I think the search for a model that is going to match everything is a little bit futile for me. You know, we know all models are simplifications of reality, and I feel the point of the paper is to show us, starting from a very clear benchmark that we understand in the literature, how much these new techniques can bring.
Thanks so much, Jean-Paul. I mean, I agree that, should I respond to this now, or should we wait for the second question? Peter, right? Okay, let's collect the two questions and I'll comment.
Thanks. So Virgil Michigan recently made a point that most of these models have a problem matching inflation and frequency relationship. So that recently what we saw, a 10% inflation and around 20% increase in the US, might be Golos of Lucas is kind of the best, but it's still not good enough to actually match this. So is your mechanism helping in matching this fact?
Yeah, let me actually collect these two questions, and they're related. So I think that's precisely the point. So one of the point of Virgilius' recent paper, and I think Jean-Paul's related paper too, is that it's a bigger problem with sticky price models. So the models that help us explain the frequency surge, such as Golos of Lucas, would predict counterfactually steep Phillips curves, and vice versa. Models that predict realistically flat Phillips curve, so stochastic menu cost models or Calvo, would really struggle with fitting the frequency. So that's precisely what we're hitting here. The argument is that a model can simultaneously give you the flat Phillips curve, even with Golos of Lucas pricing, because of Cascades dampening, while at the same time being able to explain the surge in frequency and inflation without sacrificing the Phillips curve slope. That's precisely our point. That we help resolve this kind of big picture puzzle in the sticky price literature, which is the relationship between slope and the ability to match inflation with realistically sized shocks. That's what we're really fitting here.
Thank you. Could you please elaborate on the role of the energy sector in amplifying the costs, the shocks? In the discussion on euro area inflation, you hinted at the role of commodity prices. I haven't seen it in your slide with sectoral evidence, but maybe it was too fast. But it would be very important if you think that this is indeed very central and if it stands out in amplifying supply shocks. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. So we do two commodity price shocks, one to energy and one to food. Quantitatively, I believe that food is actually more important than energy in explaining euro area inflation surge in the aggregate. Perhaps one exercise we have not done is to feed in the shocks one by one, separate just energy, because of course the shocks need not be additive in nonlinear models. So it's not clear how much of it is the two shocks acting together and kind of reinforcing each other, and how much each of them is important on its own. So perhaps we could either feed in energy and food separately, or perhaps more correctly, we should take them out one by one to kind of do the counterfactual, what would happen without that one specific shock. So I think in a non-linear setup is better. I think that would be the quantitatively correct way to answer your question.
I think we have one last final question, and then we will close. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on this. You said that food would be more important than energy. I'm just, if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because if you look at the numbers, I think back in 22, it looked like energy, at least the direct impact, was more important than food. But was it the propagation? So if you can just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so we're saying it's not the absolute sizes of price change in those sectors that were different. So for sure, energy price surge was much bigger than the food price surge. What we're saying is that the propagation of those increases in commodity prices to the aggregate CPI inflation are not proportional to the shock sizes. So although energy had a bigger price increase in that episode, the effect of the price increase on aggregate inflation in the euro area was smaller than the effect of the smaller increase in food prices. So food and energy per percent change in the price seems to have a stronger effect on the aggregate. And if you go back to one of the slides where we show you the supplier Herfindahl's, the reason is that food and energy tends to be a sector that is more concentrated in its importance as a supplier than energy. So energy is very important on average, but its supplier Herfindahl is not as large as that of food. That's the reason why. And again, that's also the reason why it would be amazing to test it in the data. So if we could really identify exogenous shifts in prices of commodity sectors, which I think would be feasible to the extent to which we believe they're exogenous to the euro area, then we could see whether the supply Herfindahl is a good sufficient statistic to predict the effect on aggregates. But again, I think that's another empirical exercise we could do to really solidify that point.